Take a look at these programs. What do you notice about the program, specifically around the squats and the deadlifts? Now, if you said that there's more volume for squats than deadlifts, then you are correct. There is a popular belief that there's always more carryover with squats to deadlifts, but not the other way around. And also that the deadlift is somehow inherently more fatiguing. Therefore, we can't and shouldn't do as much volume. But then my question is this even true? And if it is true, how valid is the conclusion about programming volume differently? Now, if you're new here, my name is Moon Chong, and I've been coaching powerlifting for over 13 years, and training powerlifters is what I think about all the time. In this video, I will break down why people think that the volume for squats and deadlift should differ, and regardless of whether that their reasons are true or not, should volume actually differ for that matter. And if you wait to the end, I'll also show you some research evidence to back up my argument as well. So let's break down the first belief, that the deadlift is inherently more fatiguing than the squats. People often back this belief up with three common reasons. First one being that there is greater absolute loading through the whole system. Second, that there is greater stress on the spine or lower back. And the third one, that there is no stretch reflex at the bottom of the deadlift. So let's address greater absolute loading. If you were to compare different absolute loading for the same movement pattern, then you have an apples to apples comparison. For example, a single squat rep of 200 kilos is obviously more fatiguing than a single squat rep of 150 kilos for the same lifter. However, when you are comparing different movements, in this case the squat and the deadlift, it's not that it's wrong, it's that you can't really compare them together. This is simply because the demands on the hip and knee extensors are different. There is also the question of the muscle lengths that you are moving through in the exercise and the total range of motion traveled through with the barbell. This study by McMahon and Pearson showed that training at a longer muscle length increases the magnitude and duration acute neuromuscular recovery needed following resistance training. So actually, in this case, you could argue that the squat may be more fatiguing than the deadlift, especially on the quads. Things like leverages will also play a huge part in this as well. For example, the arm length is going to play a big part as well. Specifically, longer arms mean shorter range of motion for the deadlift. The problem with thinking about comparison of greater absolute loading is that it's an example of a single factor comparison. The trade-off with the range of motion may be one of the few reasons why we can inherently lift more in a deadlift than in a squat. But then how about the idea that it's inherently more stressful for the back extensors? Now, there are a couple reasons why people say this. For a lot of lifters, it feels true because some lifters will feel their lower back more fatigued from being bent over more in a deadlift. This is leverages at play to an extent. But also in a squat, you are allowed to let your knees travel a little bit further forward so you don't actually stress your lower back as much. The other reasons why some lifters say this, in my opinion, is that they simply don't have good technique dialed in. Now, when you watch a sample of powerlifters deadlift, it's quite common to see some powerlifters deadlift with a slightly more rounded back. In biomechanics terms, we call that spinal flexion. Therefore, it's no wonder why they feel like their lower back feels worked more as they go through more concentric and eccentric contractions of their lumbar extensors. So what? This can potentially lead to more muscle damage, which can consequently interfere with squat performance as well. And so naturally, lifters will have the idea that the deadlift is inherently more fatiguing because of its impact on subsequent lower body sessions. Having said that, even if there is inherently more lower back fatigue from deadlifts, from being a bit more bent over in the exercise, what about the other factor that you probably get a little bit more quad fatigue from doing squats? And so in my opinion, isn't a strong reason to necessarily program the deadlift with lower volume. But then what about the fact that there's no stretch reflex at the bottom of a deadlift? Does this cause more fatigue per rep? What lifters are referring to is that because you reset muscle activation between reps, there's no stretch reflex between reps. There's an amount of relaxation of effort followed by initiating effort again in a multi-rep set. When compared to an exercise where there is no pause, for example, if you do a touch and go version of a deadlift versus regular back squats, there is definitely a subjective sense of increased demand of effort. However, just because there is increased demand in effort by executing deadlift sets with a reset between reps doesn't mean that there is relatively more damage that causes inter-session fatigue. As far as I can see, it's not even obvious whether it is or is not. But here's the thing, these are all just theoretical verbal arguments. Is there any research to back up my opinion? A 2019 study by Belcher and colleagues in well-trained lifters had subjects perform high volume sessions of squats, bench press and deadlifts. They had 4 sets to failure at 80% of the 1 rep max for each lift on separate weeks. Researchers then tracked multiple fatigue and muscle damage markers, soreness, limb swelling, range of motion, average bar speed at 70% of 1 rep max, and blood markers like creatine kinase, lactate dehydrogenase, and cell-free DNA immediately post-session and up to 96 hours later. So creatine kinase, lactate dehydrogenase, and cell-free DNA are all used as indirect markers of muscle stress and muscle damage from exercise. The key finding was that there were time-based changes in fatigue and damage within each lift, but no meaningful differences between the lifts overall, and the deadlift did not show greater fatigue or slow recovery than a squat when volume and relative intensity were matched. In fact, average bar speed dropped for the squat and bench, but did not significantly decline after the deadlift condition, further challenging the idea that the deadlift is uniquely fatiguing when programmed with comparable loading and volume. So then, if the deadlift is in fact not more fatiguing than the squat, why do so many people think so and consequently program so? I think there are a few things going on here to explain the disconnect between the research and what people experience in the gym. First, there's an intensity of strength expectation problem. For some lifts and lifters, it's an expectation issue. They're expecting to move bigger numbers. But here's the thing, your body doesn't just care about absolute load, it also cares about its relative intensity as well. When lifters can't hit the numbers that they expect, they assume that the deadlift is inherently more taxing. In reality, they might just be misjudging what they're actually capable of on that day. Second, and this is a big one, execution discipline. How many lifters do you see with genuinely tight, efficient deadlift technique compared to their squat? Squat technique often gets drilled a lot better than the deadlift. People obsess over depth, knee tracking and bar position. But for the deadlift, I reckon that lifters just often just grip and rip a little bit more often. When your deadlift technique is inefficient, the lift often feels a lot harder than it actually needs to. So you'll end up just bleeding energy everywhere. That's not necessarily the deadlift being inherently more fatiguing, but you making it more fatiguing through a sloppier execution. And third, the deadlift is somewhat easier to overshoot. With the squat, you get feedback throughout the entire rep, especially at the eccentric and at the top of the lift when the bar just feels heavy on the back. You feel it slowing down in the hole and anticipate that being worse in further reps. You sense when you're about to start grinding further reps. But for the deadlift, you don't get that same sense of difficulty on the way up. So lifters may take sets closer to failure than they actually realize. They think that they left 2 reps left in the tank, but actually they probably have less than a half a rep. Quite often with what I've seen, they often confuse a technically well executed rep that feels euphorically good to being an actually lower RPE set. Now, if you do that week after week, and of course you're going to be beaten up by the end of it. But that's not the deadlift being uniquely fatiguing, that's just a failure to auto-regulate properly. So let's address the idea that the squat has more carryover to the deadlift. In theory, this does ring true to an extent, as the squat does provide a stimulus to a similar set of prime movers, namely the quads and the glutes. They both represent movements that require extension through the hips and the knees. The squat fundamentally can go through deeper angles of hip and knee flexion, with differences largely going to lie on how much more the hamstrings are being felt in the deadlifts. However, there are limitations to this. First limitation is actually what your chosen deadlift stance is. There is also the limitation of how much your squat and the deadlift replicate each other in terms of movement due to the technique variables and the leverages too. In my opinion, this opinion of carryover does ring true from personal and professional experience. As with most things, it depends highly on the individual. So I can see this being a bigger reason to program more volume on squats than for deadlifts. So what does that mean at the end of the day? Should you or should you not program the squat and deadlift differently? My opinion is that it depends, and here's what it depends on. I think if you are a new lifter who has just started getting into powerlifting, I think you should start at a level of volume that is very easily tolerated to begin with. And what you should do over time is slowly explore and implement some progression in volume and intensity to assess what the top end tolerance is to the training volume. If you end up reaching a certain point where one of the lower body lifts starts to slow down in progress earlier from dialing volume up, this may indicate that this lift has a lower tolerance in volume. I actually think it's also very important not to assume that this will definitely be the deadlift. It may very actually well be the squat. If for whatever unknown reason that you can tolerate more volume in the deadlift than squat, I personally don't think that should stop you from programming more volume in the deadlifts, in spite of the fact that it is contrary to popular belief. Now, if you're an experienced lifter, my view is that you should be programming them independently from each other based on how things have been progressing in terms of dose response. Now, what I mean by independently doesn't mean that they have to be different, but it doesn't mean that they should be the same either. They should be programmed outside of each other's consideration initially, and what I mean by that is that you shouldn't just deliberately change the volume up or down on the deadlift just because there is X amount of volume for the squats. Ultimately, individual responses of the lifts from the lifter trumps all. What is optimal is emergent on all the constraints and decisions made. In practice, that means that each lift earns its volume on the basis of how the lifter is adapting over time, rather than being artificially balanced for the sake of symmetry or lack thereof. For example, if that happens that the deadlift day is overly fatiguing for the squat day, then through iterations, you can adjust the volume or intensity accordingly. I do actually think that for a small percentage of lifters, for leverage reasons, they can potentially benefit from doing more volume in the deadlift than in the squats. So I hope you guys found this video useful. And as always, click like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.